It was a catastrophe no one saw coming, a celestial body slamming into the fragile geopolitical structure of the ancient world. Can you believe that one single man, merely 32 years old, held the entire civilized map of the East in the palm of his hand, only to have that iron grip loosen in one final, agonizing breath? We are not talking about a mere kingdom. We are talking about a civilization stretching from the sun-baked shores of the Aegean across the impossibly rugged peaks of Anatolia, plunging deep into the Fertile Crescent, past Babylon, and all the way to the very threshold of India itself. This was the inheritance left by Alexander the Great, a chaotic, monstrously oversized gift that instantly became a curse, a promise of eternal war and unimaginable riches that poisoned every hand that touched it. And out of that primal, swirling chaos, out of the blood-soaked free-for-all known forever as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Successors, one name would eventually rise to claim the lion's share, a man whose ambition was so cold and calculating it was almost inhuman. Seleucus, the man they would call Nicator, the victor. But the true horror of this empire, the Seleucid catastrophe we are about to witness, is not that it existed, but that it was simply too large to survive. Imagine standing at the center of the known universe, holding the reins to 70 separate nations, countless languages, dozens of irreconcilable cultures, and knowing that every single prince, general, and satrap beneath you was sharpening their knives, waiting for the precise moment of your distraction or demise. This sprawling behemoth, this impossible dream drawn in blood and gold, began its life with an unprecedented explosion of power in 323 BC, the moment Alexander's magnificent body finally failed him in Babylon. The Macedonian generals, men who had marched across deserts and scaled mountains for a decade, suddenly stopped seeing each other as comrades. They saw only rivals, wolves circling the largest carcass the world had ever produced. The ensuing decades were a whirlwind of betrayal so profound, history still struggles to fully catalog the sheer scale of the backstabbing. Peucestus, Craterus, Perdiccas, Antigonus, Ptolemy, they were all titans, tearing at the edges of the map, carving temporary fiefdoms out of the ruins of their shared glory. And Seleucus, he was initially nothing more than a mid-level cavalry commander, the commander of the companion cavalry. But he possessed the one trait none of the others truly mastered: patience, combined with a chilling capacity for ruthlessness when the moment finally arrived. His initial prize was the most dangerous post imaginable, the satrapy of Babylon, the beating heart of Mesopotamia, handed to him in 321 BC during the frantic distribution of spoils at Triparadisus. It was a position of immense strategic value, but it instantly placed a target squarely on his back, visible to the older, more established power brokers, especially the terrifyingly dominant Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, who viewed the entire eastern domain as his personal property and saw Seleucus as a pest. Antigonus, a man whose shadows stretched across all of Asia Minor, decided that Seleukos was an inconvenient obstacle, a weed that needed to be violently uprooted. In 316 BC, the inevitable confrontation arrived, and Seleukos, facing certain annihilation against the overwhelming forces of the elder general, made the first of his legendary tactical retreats, a flight so desperate and daring it would become foundational to his myth. He fled Babylon with only 50 horsemen, crossing the treacherous, unforgiving Syrian desert, not to hide, but to recruit. He sought refuge with his future rival, Ptolemy I Soter, down in Egypt, the only place antagonists couldn't immediately touch. This desperate exile was not failure, it was hibernation. For 4 long years, Seleukos learned. He waited, he planned, biding his time like a predator whose prey had briefly escaped its grasp, watching the titanic battles unfold from the safety of the Nile Delta. Then, in 312 BC, the stars aligned. Ptolemy clashed with Antigonus's son, Demetrius Poliorcetes, at the Battle of Gaza. It was a brutal, decisive victory for Ptolemy, and suddenly, the path back to Babylon was open. Seleukos, sensing the precise moment of vulnerability, seized it. He demanded his own small detachment of troops and began the impossible march back across the desert, with a determination that chilled his allies and terrified his foes. This journey, known forever as the return to Babylon, is the true genesis point of the Seleukid Empire, the single moment where a fugitive transformed into a founder. He faced immediate opposition from the Antigonid garrison, but the people of Babylon, tired of endless oppression and recognizing the legitimate claim of the man who had briefly governed them, welcomed him as a liberator, throwing open the gates. The year 312 BC became the recognized start date of the Seleukid era, marking the moment Seleukos I Nicator truly took control of the impossible destiny that awaited him. But even as he claimed his crown and set his sights on the vast, unclaimed eastern provinces, the seeds of the empire's destruction were already being sown, woven into the very fabric of its creation, promising a spectacular, agonizing, 250-year-long twilight that would end in utter humiliation. The moment Alexander the Great's final rattling breath left his body in Babylon, the world stopped spinning. It was a silence filled only by the sickening crack of an empire tearing itself apart at the seams. His generals, men who had marched shoulder to shoulder from Pella to the Indus, instantly transformed into a pack of snarling, magnificent wolves circling the grandest carcass history had ever produced. They were the Diadochi, the successors, and their ambition was a colossal, incurable plague. The air in the royal courts was thick with the scent of conspiracy, the poison of unchecked power seeping into the marble floors. Who would rule? The obvious candidates were weak. A mentally deficient half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, and the unborn child of Roxana, Alexander IV. This vacuum demanded a strong hand, and the first to seize the reins of the crumbling machine was Perdiccas, the chief minister, who proclaimed himself the regent of the entire sprawling domain. Perdiccas was a brute, a loyal hammer of a general, but he lacked the subtle, serpentine cunning required to navigate this new political hellscape. He tried to rule the empire as a single, indivisible entity, a concept as dead as Alexander himself. His attempts to control the other titans, Lysimachus, Craterus, and especially Ptolemy, only accelerated the fracturing he desperately sought to prevent.
But where was our future founding father, Seleukos Nicator, during this initial bloodbath? He was not yet a king, not a satrap, but merely the commander of the elite hypaspists, the Silver Shields. He was a trusted insider, a meticulous observer, watching the tectonic plates of power shift and shatter. He kept his ambition hidden beneath a veneer of absolute loyalty, learning every fatal mistake the others were making.
The first catastrophic map drawing session, the partition of Babylon in 323 BCE, was less an agreement and more a ceasefire signed in anticipation of war. Seleucus was rewarded for his previous services, but he eyed something greater than simple command. He saw the sheer, unparalleled strategic value of Babylon, the ancient jewel of Mesopotamia, the hinge between East and West. As Perdiccas's tyranny grew intolerable, particularly his disastrous decision to try and curb the increasingly independent Ptolemy in Egypt, the other generals banded together. Seleukos aligned himself with the conspirators, recognizing that the current order had to be violently dismantled if anyone was to survive. The campaign against Egypt was a total failure, leading to Perdiccas's own troops, tired of his failures and arrogance, taking matters into their own hands. They plunged daggers into their regent, and in the resulting chaos, Seleukos was perfectly positioned to step into the light. At the next redistribution of the map, the partition of Triparadisus in 321 BCE, Seleukos demanded the satrapy of Babylon. Not just a dusty border province, but the very economic and military heart of the Near East. He got it. This was the pivotal moment. Seleukos, the general, became Seleukos, the regional potentate. He now controlled the immense wealth of the Babylonian treasury and held the gates to the eastern satrapies, the legendary riches of Iran and India. He began to consolidate his power immediately, building his own army and securing the loyalty of the local Greek and native populations, turning this strategic cornerstone into a personal fortress. But the stability was a mirage, a fleeting dream before the true nightmare began. The greatest, most terrifying force to emerge from the wreckage of the empire was Antigonus Monophthalmus, the One-Eyed. Antigonus was a warlord of staggering competence, an aging general whose single-minded goal was to resurrect Alexander's empire under his own crown. He saw himself as the rightful heir to the entire continent of Asia. Antigonus marched relentlessly, absorbing territory and eliminating rivals until he became a colossal threat to everyone else. Babylon, sitting squarely in the middle of his path of conquest, became an irresistible target. Seleukos knew with a chilling certainty that he could not yet withstand the full, terrifying might of the One-Eyed. This realization forced Seleukos into his first great act of political survival, tactical retreat. In 316 BCE, rather than face certain annihilation, Seleukos performed the unthinkable. He abandoned the city he had worked so hard to claim. He fled Babylon, gathering his small band of loyal followers and treasure, racing across the unforgiving Syro-Arabian desert, with the hounds of Antigonus nipping at his heels.
This was not a defeat. It was a calculated sacrifice, a brilliant move of self-preservation. Seleukos arrived, stripped of land and title, seeking refuge at the only place safe enough from Antigonus's reach, the court of Ptolemy Soter in Egypt. He was an exile, a refugee king without a crown, but he was armed with the most dangerous weapon of all, knowledge of his enemy's weakness, and an absolute, unquenchable desire for vengeance.
He spent 4 critical years in Egypt, not licking his wounds, but forging the iron framework of the Grand Alliance that would eventually challenge Antigonus. He convinced Ptolemy, Cassander, ruler of Macedon, and Lysimachus, ruler of Thrace, that if Antigonus was not stopped, they would all fall, one by one, into his singular iron grip. This period of exile was the crucible for the Seleukid Empire. It was here, in the shadows of the great Egyptian pyramids, that Seleukos truly learned the art of geopolitical warfare. He lost a kingdom only to gain the alliances necessary to conquer half the known world. His patience was legendary, his focus terrifyingly precise. The stage was set for the Third War of the Diadochi, a clash of titans that would decide the fate of Asia for centuries. Seleukos, the exile, was now plotting his impossible return to Babylon, a return that would not just reclaim a city, but lay the foundation for a dynasty that stretched from the Aegean to the Himalayas. The story of the Seleukid Empire is not merely a history of decline. It is a stunning saga of audacious betrayal, miraculous return, and the relentless struggle against geopolitical forces too vast for any mortal man to control. And it all began with a flight across the sand and a burning promise of retribution. The grand campaign was launched, driven by the desperation of 4 kings realizing they faced total annihilation if they failed to cooperate. Seleukos was given a small contingent, a testament to his low standing, but also a guarantee of his independence. He joined Ptolemy's forces, fighting their way up the Levantine coast, eyeing the moment to make his daring move. The turning point came in 312 BCE, the year that would forever be known as the birth year of the Seleukid era. After Ptolemy decisively crushed Antigonus's son Demetrius Poliorcetes at the Battle of Gaza, Seleukos knew the path was clear. Antigonus's forces in Babylon were scattered, and the moment for the impossible had arrived. With only 1,000 infantry and 200 cavalry, a ridiculously small force to reclaim the capital of the East, Seleukos set off on the long, dangerous march back across the desert. This was pure, unadulterated audacity, a gamble that defied all military logic. But Seleukos was not relying on numbers. He was relying on the loyalty he had cultivated and the sheer surprise of his reappearance. The population of Babylon, tired of the oppressive rule of Antigonus's governor, welcomed their former satrap like a savior. The remaining garrison surrendered quickly. Seleukos had reclaimed his throne without a major battle. He walked back into the immense city, not as a conqueror, but as the rightful master, establishing 312 BCE as the official start of the Seleucid Age. This moment marked the formal separation of the Seleukid Empire from the squabbling Western kingdoms. Seleukos was no longer merely a satrap. He was the king of Babylon, and his eyes were already turning east toward the vast, untamed wealth of the Iranian plateau. The first phase of survival was over, but the second, the impossible task of conquering and holding the entirety of Alexander's Asian legacy, was just beginning. He immediately launched a massive, decade-long military campaign known as the Eastern Anabasis. While his rivals were still fighting over scraps in Greece and Anatolia, Seleukos marched into Media, Persia, Bactria, and Sogdiana, often negotiating rather than fighting, accepting submission and incorporating local elites into his administration. He pushed his boundaries further than even Alexander had successfully administered, venturing deep into the Indian subcontinent. He encountered the powerful new Mauryan Empire, led by Chandragupta Maurya, a force Seleukos wisely chose not to destroy, but to negotiate with. The resulting treaty was astonishing. Seleukos ceded the easternmost territories, including parts of modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, in exchange for 500 war elephants, a strategic asset of unparalleled value in the Hellenistic world. This single transaction secured his eastern border and provided him with the shock troops needed to face the greatest threats in the West. By the turn of the century, Seleukos had amassed a personal empire stretching from the Indus River to the Mediterranean, an empire so vast it was almost mythological. He was the undisputed ruler of Asia, the true heir to Alexander's eastern dominion. But he knew, chillingly, that the real test was yet to come. The final showdown with the man who had driven him into exile, Antagonus Monophthalmus, who was still determined to claim it all. Antigonus Monophthalus, the one-eyed Titan, believed he was destiny incarnate. He was over 80 years old, yet his ambition burned hotter than a desert forge. He saw the entire map of Alexander's empire as his personal inheritance, and Seleukos, with every other upstart Diadochi, was merely a pebble in his path to absolute dominion. The air crackled with the certainty of war, a conflict that would determine if the world would be ruled by one man or split into shattered kingdoms. The other kings, Ptolemy, the calculating hoarder, Lysimachus, the ruthless Thracian, and Cassander, the shadowy ruler of Macedon, realized the terrifying truth. If Antigonus won, they would all be utterly annihilated. They scrambled, not as friends, but as terrified rivals, forging a temporary, brittle chain of steel aimed directly at the heart of the Antigonid power base. This was the final, desperate roll of the dice in the Wars of the Successors. Seleucus, recently returned to Babylon, was the essential linchpin of this fragile new alliance. He was bringing the vast, untapped human and material resources of the eastern satrapies, the land stretching to the Indus, into the fight. Critically, he brought the one weapon no one else possessed in such overwhelming numbers, the fearsome war elephants, 480 living, moving tanks, captured and trained for this very moment. This wasn't just a political squabble. It was the final, agonizing paroxysm of Alexander's dream, a colossal death match that would decide the structure of the next 3 centuries. The two sides marched relentlessly towards Phrygia, converging near the town of Ipsus in 301 BCE. Antigonus, alongside his magnetic, brilliant, yet fundamentally reckless son, Demetrius the Besieger, brought close to 70,000 veteran infantry and 10,000 cavalry, forces honed by decades of relentless campaigning. Opposing him, the combined armies of the allied kings mustered an even larger host, a staggering, terrifying display of Hellenistic military might, totaling perhaps 75,000 highly motivated soldiers. The sheer scale of the confrontation was unprecedented since Gaugamela. The battlefield was a whirlwind of dust, noise, and sheer terror. Antigonus, standing defiant on his command hill, watched as the armies clashed in an earth-shattering roar that could be heard for miles. The initial action saw Demetrius, leading the Antigonid heavy cavalry, execute a flawless, terrifying charge that shattered the allied left wing, driving Lysimachus's horsemen completely off the field in panicked retreat. This was the moment of decision, the fatal pivot upon which the entire course of history would turn. Demetrius, intoxicated by the heady rush of victory, pursued the broken enemy far, far too aggressively. His bloodlust and arrogance led him to completely isolate his father's main infantry phalanx, leaving it exposed and vulnerable. And then the ground began to tremble, not from charging horses, but from something far heavier, far more primal. Seleucus, ever the strategic genius who understood logistics and timing above raw courage, unleashed his secret weapon. The 480 war elephants, positioned with chilling precision, surged forward. These colossal beasts formed an impenetrable, moving wall of muscle and ivory tusks. They were positioned perfectly to cut off Demetrius's triumphant, scattered cavalry from ever returning to aid the main Antigonid line. Demetrius looked back only to see a living gray fortress separating him from his father, a horrifying realization dawning in the heat of battle, that his momentary victory had, in fact, been his total undoing. He was trapped, uselessly celebrating a victory he could not capitalize upon. But Demetrius never came. A massive hail of javelins, launched by the disciplined infantry of Lysimachus and Seleucus, found their mark. the one-eyed Titan, the man who dreamed of uniting the world under his singular iron fist, fell from his horse, instantly dead, at the venerable age of 81. His vision of a unified empire died with a sudden, dull thud in the dust of Phrygia. The Battle of Ipsus was over. The map of the Hellenistic world was violently, irrevocably redrawn in the span of a single afternoon, decided by the brilliant deployment of Indian behemoths. The spoils were colossal, a feast for the victors, and Seleukos, who had played the most cautious and effective long game, claimed the lion's share, immediately demanding his compensation. He seized the vast territories of eastern Asia Minor, including Cappadocia and Phrygia, doubling his already sprawling territory. But most critically and most definingly for the future identity of his new kingdom, he claimed the crucial, wealthy region of northern Syria. This land was not just fertile, it was the gateway to the Mediterranean world and the indispensable trade routes connecting the wealth of the East to the markets of the West. Seleukos knew he couldn't possibly rule this sprawling, newly acquired domain from distant Mesopotamian Babylon. He desperately needed a new heart, a core city that faced the Mediterranean and served as a nexus between the riches of the East and the politics of the West. Thus, Seleukos founded Antioch on the Orontes River, named after his father, a magnificent statement of absolute permanence and burgeoning power. This city, glittering and destined for centuries of influence and intrigue, would become the scandalous, essential, and sometimes rebellious capital of the Seleukid Empire for the next 3 centuries, a true Hellenistic metropolis designed specifically to rival the glory of Alexandria itself. But even this monumental victory brought immediate, venomous conflict. While Seleukos was busy securing his new territories in Asia Minor, Ptolemy Soter of Egypt, ever the vulture, had quietly swept in and occupied the most crucial strategic jewel of the entire Levant, Colle, Syria. This narrow, fertile strip of land included the invaluable port city of Tyre and the essential trade routes leading south towards Egypt. Seleukos, furious but exhausted by the monumental war, confronted his old ally. Ptolemy, coolly defiant and utterly unconcerned by Seleukos's fury, simply stated that he was holding the land in trust for the alliance, a thin, transparent lie that fooled absolutely no one. This casual, friendly-sounding betrayal established the single greatest geopolitical cancer that would plague the Seleukid dynasty for the next 150 years, the brutal, relentless Syrian wars. Seleukos had won the war against the Titan, but the seeds of countless future bloodbaths were already sown, demanding eternal vigilance, eternal blood, and eternal gold, just to maintain the borders of an empire that was already bleeding. The cost of maintaining those impossible borders was measured not just in gold, but in the rapid, horrifying erosion of sovereignty itself. Every year the empire survived was a miracle, bought with the blood of mercenaries and the frantic, desperate efforts of kings constantly facing threats from every cardinal direction, a geopolitical nightmare wrapped in a golden crown. The Seleukid Empire was a ship perpetually taking on water, and the crew was too busy fighting over the captain's hat to man the pumps. Look eastward into the endless, sun-baked plains where Alexander had marched, where the very soil was soaked with the sweat of his ambition. That vast, distant land was the first to feel the tug of independence, the first to realize that the grand capital of Antioch was simply too far away to matter, its influence attenuated by 1,000 miles of desert and mountain. This was the moment the myth of Hellenic unity began to crumble, not with a massive foreign invasion, but with the quiet, devastating declaration of autonomy from men who felt utterly forgotten by the distant throne.
Up in the rugged, mineral-rich mountains of Bactria, the satrap Diadochi had been quietly consolidating power, watching the incessant, murderous squabbling between the successors with cold calculation. He saw the Seleucid core consumed by the Western wars, the eternal, paralyzing conflict with the Ptolemies, as his golden opportunity, a divine invitation to become a king in his own right, far beyond the reach of Babylon's tax collectors. His move was an act of audacious, world-changing treason, permanently cleaving the wealthiest provinces of the Far East from the Seleucid grasp, shrinking the empire not by inches, but by entire continents. The loss was seismic, but before the central authority could even truly react, a new and far more terrifying enemy emerged: the Parthians. They were a nomadic storm brewing on the northern steppes, brutal, resilient horsemen who learned to fight not against fortified walls, but against the very concept of stability and organized resistance. They were not interested in Greek philosophy or courtly politics. They were interested in resources, plunder, and conquest, seeing the distracted, weakened Seleucid garrisons as nothing more than easy prey.
Their appearance was the catastrophic, fatal wound to the eastern flank, a fast-moving, virulent cancer that the succeeding Seleucid kings, perpetually focused on Egypt and the Mediterranean, could never fully eradicate. They consumed territory with frightening speed, carving out their own empire from the rotting edges of the Seleucid dominion, leaving the great king with a title that increasingly mocked his actual domain. While the East was burning and irrevocably fragmenting, the West was drowning in royal blood, fueled by the most bitter and enduring rivalry in antiquity, the struggle against the Ptolemies of Egypt. These were the Syrian wars, a brutal, cyclical, exhausting conflict, where the prize was control over Coele Syria, the strategic gateway to the Mediterranean and the economic nerve center of the region. Every generation of Seleucids inherited this curse, this perpetual shadow duel with the wealthiest, most strategically entrenched dynasty in the entire Hellenistic world. Alexandria, fueled by the Nile's eternal bounty and the vast grain trade, was an unassailable fortress of gold, while the Seleucid capital of Antioch, though magnificent, always felt perpetually vulnerable, exposed to attack from the sea and the desert.
These wars were far more than a simple border dispute. They were a desperate, existential fight for legitimacy, for the right to be recognized as the true inheritor of Alexander's ultimate authority, a legacy the Ptolemies claimed through their control of Alexander's actual, mummified body. The stakes could not have been higher, and the tension finally exploded into the shocking ferocity of the Third Syrian War, often known as the Laodicean War.
The sudden assassination of Seleukos II's mother created a profound power vacuum, and Ptolemy III Euergetes wasted no time, launching an invasion so deep, so penetrating, that it shook the very foundations of the Seleucid world. Imagine the horror that swept through Antioch. Egyptian forces, the heart of the enemy, penetrating as far as Babylon, even reaching the borders of Iran itself. The capital was exposed, the treasury vulnerable, and the army scattered. Seleukos II Callinicus, the aptly named victory giver, who rarely experienced victory, found himself governing a kingdom shattered and reduced to desperate straits, forced to fight a catastrophic war on two fronts he could not possibly win. His reign was defined by utter desperation, a frantic, costly scramble to defend Antioch and the vital western routes, while simultaneously attempting the impossible, a march east to reassert control over the now fully rebellious satrapies. It was a mission requiring resources that the collapsing, bleeding empire simply did not possess.
But as if foreign enemies weren't enough, the Seleucid family itself was a viper pit of treachery. The king's own younger brother, Antiochus Hyrax, decided this was the perfect moment to declare his own independence in Anatolia, initiating a paralyzing, destructive civil war. This was the ultimate betrayal, the knife twisted deepest into the state's back, forcing Seleukos II to expend precious, irreplaceable resources fighting his own bloodline instead of the invaders at his gates. The empire was not just being attacked, it was eating itself alive.
This fratricidal nightmare culminated in the infamous Battle of Ancyra around 235 BC, where Seleukos II, fighting his own brother, was decisively and humiliatingly defeated. This was not just a loss of troops, it was a profound, irreversible blow to royal authority, confirming to every restless governor, every opportunistic general, and every ambitious neighbor that the Seleucid core was fatally compromised and fractured beyond repair. The center could not hold. The sheer scale of the disaster in Anatolia meant that Seleukos II could no longer even pretend to address the eastern problems. The loss was total. Bactria was now fully gone, securing its independence. Parthia was solidifying its hold, pushing ever further west. The Seleucid presence beyond Mesopotamia was reduced to a few scattered, desperate pockets of resistance, effectively conceding the vast, rich territories that had initially made the empire the undisputed largest of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Seleukos II died shortly after, in a freak and anticlimactic accident, thrown from his horse. A mundane end for a king defined by superhuman struggle against insurmountable odds. But his death solved nothing. It merely cleared the stage for the next round of violence, the next generation inheriting the impossible debt of blood and territory, desperately trying to salvage a crown that was already rusting away in the unforgiving sands of history. The crisis was not averted. It was merely delayed, waiting for the next ambitious titan to try and hold the fragments of Alexander's dream together, demanding eternal vigilance, eternal blood, and eternal gold, just to maintain the borders of an empire that was already bleeding. Seleukos Nicator, the victor, now sat upon a throne forged not of gold, but of impossible distances and the ghosts of dead kings. He controlled the land from the shores of the Mediterranean all the way to the Indus River, an imaginable stretch of sand, mountains, and defiant cultures that stretched the limits of logistical possibility. Yet, every single sunrise brought with it the icy realization that his vast kingdom was merely a target painted on the map, visible to the one man who still dared to dream Alexander's entire undivided dream, the terrifying Antigonus Monophthalmus. This one-eyed titan, the master strategist, who had tasted victory more times than any other living Diadochi, viewed Seleukos not as a peer, but as a dangerous, ambitious subordinate who had stolen territory that rightfully belonged to the Antigonid house. The air grew thick with silent threats, the diplomatic missives laced with arsenic, as the two giants prepared for the collision that would decide the fate of Asia itself, the ultimate, unavoidable reckoning that hung over the entire geopolitical sphere. Antigonus was the Goliath, already controlling Asia Minor and flexing his muscle in Greece, daring the world to challenge his self-declared dominion. And Seleukos knew that this rivalry could only end with one of them utterly annihilated. While the West prepared for this cataclysmic war, Seleukos executed a masterstroke of geopolitical genius, a move that Alexander had attempted but never fully cemented: true cultural synthesis. He married Apama, the Persian noblewoman, setting an example for his entire officer corps, demanding they look past the biases of Hellenic superiority and embrace the raw power and ancient wisdom of their new subjects. This was not just a fleeting political alliance. It was a desperate, foundational attempt to forge a deeply rooted, dual identity for the Seleucid state, one that could withstand the inevitable centrifugal forces pulling the empire apart through sheer diversity and scale. He founded monumental cities like Seleucia on the Tigris, massive hubs of trade and Hellenic culture planted deep into the Mesopotamian soil, anchoring his precarious rule with steel and stone, a network of loyal, armed settlements. But even with the East stabilized and bound by blood, the shadow of Antigonus lengthened, stretching across the Mesopotamian plains and threatening to consume all. Antigonus had grown too bold, declaring himself king and maneuvering his son Demetrius Poliorcetes into seizing strategic territories, effectively claiming dominion over Greece and much of Asia Minor. This audacious power grab sent shivers down the spine of every other Diadochi, forcing the ultimate, uneasy truce between mortal enemies who knew that if Antigonus won, they would all be next on his unforgiving list. Suddenly, Seleukos found himself allied with the very men who had previously tried to destroy him. Cassander, the shrewd and ruthless ruler of Macedon, Lysimachus, the brutal Thracian warlord, and Ptolemy, the cautious but brilliant master of Egypt. The coalition of fear was formed, a brittle, temporary alliance, united by one single terrifying objective: the swift and utter obliteration of the Antigonid threat before it became absolute and irreversible. This fragile pact, bound only by mutual terror and the smell of impending doom, became the inevitable engine driving the world toward the most decisive conflict of the entire Hellenistic age, a battle destined to occur on the sleepy, unforgiving plains of Phrygia, a nondescript place called Ipsus. The year was 301 BC. The armies gathered, hundreds of thousands of men, the last great host of Alexander's veterans, facing off against each other in a final, brutal contest for planetary supremacy. Antagonus, nearly 80 years old, stood defiant, convinced that destiny itself had chosen him for total victory, relying on the genius of his son, Demetrius, the besieger.
But Seleukos had brought the secret weapon, the game-changer he had acquired after his successful, hard-won Indian campaign. The terrifying, unstoppable wall of 500 war elephants, creatures of pure, tramping destruction that the Western Greeks had never learned to truly counter.
The battle raged, a maelstrom of bronze and blood, with Demetrius's legendary cavalry breaking through the Allied lines in a spectacular display of tactical brilliance, seemingly on the verge of turning the tide. But Demetrius, consumed by the glory of the chase, pushed too far, separating himself irrevocably from the main Antigonid phalanx in a catastrophic error of judgment that would cost his father the war and his life. This was the pivotal, agonizing moment Seleukos, the cautious opportunist, seized the narrative. He deployed his elephant corps, a living, breathing barrier of mountainous beasts, effectively blocking Demetrius's frantic, belated attempt to rejoin his father's struggling infantry. Trapped and exposed, the Antigonid foot soldiers, disheartened and suddenly leaderless, began to waver under the relentless pressure of Lysimachus and the combined phalanxes. Then came the final, tragic blow. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed king who had ruled Asia for decades, fell in battle, struck down by a volley of javelins, his dying words echoing the ultimate finality of his magnificent, blood-soaked dream. The Battle of Ipsus was not merely a victory. It was a violent, permanent execution of the old world order, and the Seleukid Empire was the undeniable, monstrous beneficiary. With Antagonus dead, the world was carved up again, but this time Seleukos demanded the lion's share, proving that true power is claimed on the battlefield, not inherited through lineage or proclamation. He seized Syria and Eastern Asia Minor, adding the critical Mediterranean port cities and the strategic gateway of Antioch to his already colossal domain, cementing his presence on the vital sea lanes. His empire now spanned the entirety of what was left of Alexander's Asian conquests, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Hindu Kush Mountains, an overwhelming, staggering territory that dwarfed all his remaining rivals combined. But this immense victory brought with it an immense new problem: the eternal friction with Ptolemy, who had subtly and illegally occupied Coele Syria, southern Syria, including Judea, during the chaos of the war, a territory vital to Seleucid strategic interests. Ptolemy refused to surrender this land, claiming he had occupied it for the coalition, a transparent lie disguised as necessity.
This immediate, cynical betrayal planted the seed of the Syrian wars, a conflict that would fester and bleed the Seleucid dynasty white for the next century, proving that even the grandest victory only clears the battlefield for the next, more complicated and far more costly war.
Seleucus had defeated the greatest rival of his age, but he had inherited a geographical curse, an empire too large, too diverse, and too strategically contested to ever truly find lasting, meaningful peace. He had become the undisputed king of Asia, the master of the world's largest empire, but the price of that crown was ceaseless, grinding warfare. He now turned his gaze westward, aiming for the ultimate prize, the original homeland itself, the jewel of Macedon, a move that would prove to be his most audacious, and ultimately his final act on this blood-soaked stage. The aged, battle-hardened lion of Asia, Seleukos Nicator, now stood at the threshold of the final chapter. He had defeated the massive army of Antigonus at Ipsus, shattered Demetrius, and consumed virtually every kingdom east of the Aegean. Yet the yearning for his homeland, for the rough soil of Macedon, remained an obsession that drove his every calculated step.
The year was 281 BCE, and the political map of the Hellenistic world had been distilled into a brutal two-man struggle. Seleucus, the undisputed master of the East, versus Lysimachus, the remaining king of Thrace and Macedon, a figure steeped in the legacy of Alexander, but rapidly losing his grip on reality.
Seleucus, now pushing 80 years old, crossed the Hellespont, his massive army, bloated with the treasures of Persia and the veteran discipline of Babylon, following him like an inevitable tide. This was not just a military campaign. It was a pilgrimage of ultimate triumph. He was coming home to claim the crown he had earned over 4 decades of endless, bloody conflict. Lysimachus, old and paranoid, had recently destabilized his own kingdom through a series of tragic, politically motivated murders, alienating his court and weakening the loyalty of his forces just when he needed it most. He stood alone, facing the inevitable. The final seismic clash of the founding generation, the Diadochi, was set at Corapedium, a place whose very name would forever echo the sound of an era closing. It was Seleucus's last stand, even if he didn't know it. The battle itself was less a clash of tactical brilliance and more a collision of two tired but terrifyingly effective forces. Lysimachus fought with the desperate ferocity of a trapped animal, knowing that everything he had built was collapsing around him. But the discipline and sheer numerical superiority of the Seleucid heavy infantry were too much. When the dust settled, The unimaginable had happened. Lysimachus, the lion of Thrace, lay dead on the field, cut down in the melee. Seleukos Nicator had won. Victory was absolute. Seleukos was now, technically, the king of kings, ruler of the entire inherited empire from the Indus River to the Adriatic Sea. The dream of a unified Alexandrian successor state, impossible for 40 years, had finally materialized, clutched in the trembling, aged hands of its most unlikely survivor. The weight of the world was now his. He celebrated, yes, but the shadows were already gathering, drawn by the smell of unchallenged power. Among those shadows lurked a viper named Ptolemy Kyranos, the Thunderbolt. This was the disgraced son of Ptolemy Soter of Egypt, driven out of Alexandria by his own family's dynastic squabbles. A man of ruthless ambition and zero loyalty, now seeking refuge and a new throne. Kyranos was desperate, charming, and utterly deadly. He approached Seleukos, flattering the aging victor, pledging allegiance and offering his services as a guide and advisor through the complicated political maze of Macedon. Seleukos, perhaps blinded by the sheer ecstasy of final victory, perhaps merely too tired to perceive the danger, welcomed Kyranos into his innermost circle. It was the fatal misjudgment of a man who had survived every conceivable threat for half a century, only to fall to a smiling opportunist. The path forward into Thrace, and Seleukos planned a stop at a sacred altar near Lysimachia. It was here, on European soil, the ground he had fought so long to reach, that destiny delivered its cruelest blow. As Seleukos offered sacrifice, his mind likely swirling with plans for the massive reorganization of his newfound European territories, Kyranos struck. Quick as the viper he was, the thunderbolt plunged a dagger into the unsuspecting body of the great Nicator. It was not a battle, it was an execution. Seleukos I, the founder of the largest empire on earth, the man who had outlived Antigonus, Demetrius, and Lysimachus, died alone, betrayed by a refugee, just 7 months after achieving absolute power. The world reeled from the shock. The greatest king was gone. His magnificent, unified continental empire, built painstakingly over 40 years, instantly dissolved in a sea of chaos and opportunistic violence. Kyranos, having committed regicide of the highest order, immediately seized control of Macedon, stealing the crown Seleukos had just won, declaring himself king. The speed and brutality of the betrayal stunned everyone. What did this mean for the vast Asian territories, the heartland of the Seleucid dynasty? The moment the news traveled east across the Aegean, the vultures began to circle. The governors Seleukos had installed, the cities he had founded, the enormous treasury he had accumulated, all were now vulnerable, headless. The colossal empire of the Seleucids was plunged into the first of its inevitable crises, a crisis of succession, identity, and sheer raw survival. The death of Seleukos, the last of the original heroes, signaled not just the end of a man, but the end of the age of the Diadochi, ushering in the brutal, fragmented Hellenistic era. The burden of this unprecedented disaster fell entirely upon the shoulders of the heir, Antiochus I Soter, the quiet, scholarly son who suddenly found himself ruling the largest, most unstable empire in history, surrounded by enemies who smelled blood in the water. Thoros, desperate, and facing internal dissent from his own Armenian subjects, who feared the coming Turkish storm far more than the Frankish invaders, welcomed the strong, iron fist of the Western warlord. He adopted Baldwin as his son, sealing the precarious political alliance with a grand feast and a temporary, fragile peace, believing he had bought his survival. But in the cutthroat politics of survival, blood ties meant absolutely nothing when real power was on the table. Within days, the highly volatile citizens of Edessa, encouraged or perhaps coerced by Baldwin's sudden intimidating presence and his promise of stability, rose up in a terrifying spasm of internal, bloody violence. Thoros was overthrown, dragged through the streets, and brutally murdered as the Frankish troops watched in cold silence. Baldwin of Boulogne, standing atop the blood-soaked walls, had done what no crusader had yet achieved through pure military might. He had founded the very first Frankish state in the Middle East. The county of Edessa was born, a dangerous, isolated bastion of European power, secured entirely by ambition and cemented by calculated political assassination, fundamentally altering the nature of the entire enterprise. The religious fever dream had become a colonial expansion. Meanwhile, the main force, Godfrey, Bohemond, Raymond of Toulouse, arrived before the sheer, terrifying walls of Antioch, oblivious to Baldwin's stunning betrayal, their attention consumed by the sheer, staggering impossibility of the task ahead. Antioch was not merely a fortress, it was a nightmare rendered in stone, defying gravity and engineering. This was not some hastily fortified hamlet or an open-field battle to be decided by cavalry charges. This was one of the most heavily defended cities in the known world. Its walls, built by the Romans and reinforced across a millennium by Byzantine engineers, rose up the sheer slopes of Mount Silpius, a terrifying labyrinth of towers, deep ditches, and massive, unyielding gates. Its defenders were led by the formidable Emir Yagi Sian, a man known for his unflinching resolve, his absolute discipline, and his deep, venomous hatred for the encroaching Franks. He knew the strategic value of this city better than anyone. If Antioch fell, the entire northern gateway to the Holy Land was irrevocably blown open, and the path to Jerusalem was clear for the fanatical barbarians. Yagi Sion was ready for them. He had ruthlessly expelled the majority of the Greek Orthodox Christians, those he rightfully distrusted, and had stockpiled enough provisions to outlast a decade-long siege. He watched the approaching Crusader army, stretched thin and exhausted, and smiled from his battlements, certain that the Syrian winter and starvation would do his lethal work for him, consuming the invaders whole. The Crusaders arrived in late October 1097, facing the onset of the wet, miserable season. The initial shock was utterly palpable. They had been promised rich, easily conquered cities by Alexios I. They found an invincible fortress that mocked their every effort. The army, perhaps 30,000 fighting men strong at this point, could not possibly encircle the colossal circumference of the walls, leaving massive sections, particularly the vital southern gates, completely unguarded.
Bohemond of Taranto, ever the military pragmatist and easily the most gifted strategic mind among the warring princes, immediately grasped the grim reality. This would not be a quick siege decided by a single bloody assault. This would be a desperate, soul-crushing war of attrition, fought not just against the Turkish defenders, but against the brutal Syrian winter that was already beginning to bite with chilling, murderous ferocity. The great siege began. The Franks camped on the northern side, near the gate of St. Paul, facing the Orontes River. But their disastrous inability to fully blockade the city meant that vital supplies, necessary reinforcements, and crucial intelligence continued to flow unimpeded to Yagi Sion through the undefended southern gates and across the treacherous terrain of Mount Silpius. It became a deadly waiting game, a slow, agonizing grind. Weeks turned into months. The initial religious fervor evaporated under the endless rain and cold, replaced by the bitter cold and the gnawing, paralyzing hunger. The provisions they had carried from Byzantine lands were consumed rapidly, and the surrounding countryside was stripped bare by increasingly desperate, often murderous foraging parties. The Crusaders, who had come on a divine mission to liberate the Holy Land, were now themselves prisoners of the colossal stone monster they intended to slay. They were starving, freezing, and facing constant, terrifying, highly disciplined sorties from the Turkish defenders who knew the terrain intimately and struck with brutal efficiency. The siege of Antioch was not merely a military operation. It was a deep, existential descent into medieval horror, where the thin line between savior and savage dissolved completely under the strain of absolute deprivation. The true final test of the entire crusade had just begun, and the world held its breath, waiting to see if these ragged zealots would find salvation or merely their mass grave beneath those towering, unforgiving walls. The walls of Antioch. They were not merely fortifications. They were the terrifying, final testament to Roman strength and Islamic mastery. A barrier of sheer, unyielding stone that mocked the desperate faith of the arriving crusaders. This was not Nicaea, vulnerable to trickery and swift assault. Antioch was the prize, the colossal jewel, defended by nearly 20 miles of towering battlements, bristling with 400 watchtowers that seemed to glare down at the Christian camp with ancient, cold malice. The sheer scale of the defense was paralyzing. Under the command of Governor Yagi Sion, a hardened, astute military leader, the city was prepared for a siege that could last years. The moment the main body of the Crusader host arrived in October 1097, the euphoria of survival evaporated.
replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty. They had encountered an obstacle that might actually be unbreakable. Initial reconnaissance revealed the horrific truth. To surround the city completely was impossible. The army was simply too thin, too exhausted, and too poorly supplied. The sheer circumference demanded a logistical miracle they could not provide. They settled for investing only the crucial northern and western gates, leaving the eastern and southern flanks partially open, a desperate gamble that Yagi Sian was shrewd enough to exploit, allowing limited resupply to trickle in. Then came the winter. It was not just cold. It was a relentless, soul-crushing torrent of rain and mud that turned the Crusader camp, already a cesspool of disease, into a literal swamp of despair. The spiritual fever that had fueled their march began to break, replaced by the shivering misery of famine and dysentery. Ptolemy III Euergetes, Berenice's brother, reacted not with measured diplomacy, but with the righteous fury of a truly aggrieved king demanding immediate, bloody justice. He launched an invasion so deep, so successful, that it threatened to dismantle the Seleukid Empire entirely.
His forces pushed deep into Mesopotamia, reaching even Babylon and perhaps beyond, an astonishing feat of military penetration that demonstrated the profound weakness at the Seleucid core. The Ptolemaic armies, fueled by revenge and immense wealth, seemed unstoppable, sweeping through the Levant and claiming almost all the strategic coastal cities in a matter of months.
The great princes, Godfrey, Raymond, and especially Bohemond, whose keen eye saw every crack in the military machine, struggled violently to maintain control. They knew lifting the siege meant the absolute end of the crusade and eternal damnation in the eyes of the West. They had to hold, even if it meant cannibalizing their own supplies and sacrificing their troops to starvation.
Bohemond, the cunning Norman, understood that the siege could only be won by attrition and control of the external supply lines. He orchestrated a devastating, brutal raid to secure the crucial iron bridge, Jisr al-Hadid, to the east, a vital artery for the city's supplies and the expected Turkish reinforcements. It was a vicious, necessary bloodletting that bought them temporary, fragile control over the immediate environment. This siege was not a battle of heroes. It was a test of the soul's endurance against the most squalid conditions imaginable. The spiritual fire was banked under layers of mud and filth. Priests reported finding hidden caches of grain among the wealthy nobles, sparking fury and near mutiny among the foot soldiers, who were reduced to eating roots, grass, and boiled leather. The internal rot threatened to destroy the army faster than the arrows from the ramparts. The princes, recognizing the imminent collapse of morale, were forced to stage desperate, highly visible religious ceremonies, fasting, processions, public confessions, to try and rekindle the dying fanaticism that had brought them this far. They needed a miracle, or at least a monumental victory, to snap the army back into fighting shape. And as the winter finally started to recede, a terrifying new factor entered the equation: The outside world had heard of the Crusaders' plight, and the great Seljuk emirs were mobilizing. Antioch was a fortress, but the Crusaders were about to find themselves besieged by a massive relief force from Mosul, commanded by the fearsome Kerboga. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The entire exhausted, starving army, clinging desperately to the muddy ground outside the unconquered iron walls, was now forced to turn its gaze eastward, knowing that a new, infinitely more dangerous enemy was marching swiftly toward them. The siege of Antioch had just escalated from a test of endurance to a fight for total, horrifying annihilation. Caught between the impenetrable walls of the city and the roaring tide of the Islamic world coming to crush them. The walls of Antioch had become a suffocating, lethal cage for the faithful. Starvation had chewed through the ranks, turning hardened knights into skeletal shadows, haunted by the smell of burning refuse and the constant, mocking silence from the citadel high above them. They were eating their boots, boiling the saddles, praying for death just to end the gnawing emptiness that had replaced their holy purpose. Desertion was rampant, a trickle that became a flood, with great leaders like Stephen of Blois abandoning the cause, claiming the entire venture was cursed and utterly hopeless, fleeing back toward Constantinople and spreading the poisonous rumor of inevitable defeat. The dramatic tales recorded later speak of divine intervention, of terrifying specters and celestial horsemen appearing to strike down the would-be plunderers, protecting the sanctuary from the desperate Seleucid hands. Whether true or simply magnificent propaganda, the fact remains. The attempt failed, the money remained desperately elusive, and the financial crisis deepened, fueled by divine spite or political incompetence. It hardly mattered. The Crusaders were dying at a rate that dwarfed the previous battles, not by sword, but by the slow, agonizing cruelty of hunger and typhoid, turning the liberated city into a charnel house where the living envied the dead. Then the true nightmare materialized, darkening the entire horizon. The sky, once empty save for the scattered campfires of the beleaguered Franks, suddenly vanished beneath the dust cloud of an army so enormous, so disciplined, that it made the previous Seljuk forces look like a scattered raiding party. This was Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, leading a unified Turkish-Arab juggernaut mobilized by the Sultan, specifically designed to wipe the Western invaders from the face of the Levant forever. He arrived with terrifying speed, immediately sealing the Crusaders inside Antioch, reversing the roles of the besieged and the besieger with brutal efficiency, trapping them between the hostile citadel holding out in the south and his endless lines of horse archers outside the city walls. This was the combined might of the Islamic world, finally unified and determined to crush the infestation. Bohemond, Godfrey, and Raymond of Toulouse looked upon the crushing numerical superiority and knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that their final moment was at hand, that this was not a skirmish, but the final judgment for their entire world. Every path out was sealed, and the larder was empty. Fear became fanaticism, and fanaticism quickly spiraled into outright madness. The men were starving. They were outnumbered 20-1, and every single prayer felt like it was hitting a ceiling of solid brass, deaf to their pleas from a distant, uncaring heaven. It was in this abyss of hopelessness that the whispers started, carried by the starving wind inside the battered city walls. Whispers of a divine intervention, a hidden secret waiting beneath the floorboards of an ancient church. A final, desperate gamble for salvation. Enter Peter Bartholomew, a peasant pilgrim and visionary who claimed to have received a series of terrifying, vivid dreams from St. Andrew himself. These weren't subtle messages. These were thunderbolts of instruction, pointing directly to the hidden location of one of the most sacred relics in all of Christendom, the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross, hidden centuries ago for safekeeping. Bartholomew swore to the skeptical, cynical leaders, especially the pragmatic Norman Bohemond, that this lance was buried deep beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter within the city, and that its discovery would be the single divine sign required to turn their impending annihilation into the glorious, unstoppable victory promised by God. The nobles were suspicious. They were disgusted. This sounded like the desperate ravings of a starving man, a dangerous illusion designed to ignite false hope. Yet their desperation was such that they couldn't afford to ignore even the faintest glimmer of hope, no matter how outlandish or impossible the claim, because the alternative was certain death and the complete failure of the mission. The skeptical Bohemond and Godfrey waited outside, ready to denounce the peasant as a fraud and execute him the moment the digging proved futile, ready to face the inevitable surrender that failure would necessitate. Then, after endless hours of fruitless labor, just as the sun was setting and the air was thick with disappointment, the clang of metal against stone resonated through the earth, a sound that shook the foundations of the crusade itself. Peter Bartholomew himself leaped into the pit, and after frantic scraping pulled forth a rusted, unremarkable piece of iron, the holy lance, they claimed, brought forth from the very soil of Antioch, an undeniable miracle bestowed upon the suffering army, a direct communication from God himself. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't just a relic. It was the physical manifestation of God choosing them over death, a tangible connection to the power of the divine. The starved men, who moments before had been ready to surrender, were now imbued with a terrifying, supernatural confidence, their bodies running on pure, unadulterated zealotry. The fear vanished, replaced by an ecstatic, murderous fervor. They immediately scheduled the counterattack, ignoring the fact that Kerboga's army was still monstrously larger, better equipped, and infinitely better fed. The strategic situation was still impossible. The psychological shift was everything, turning a broken army into a spiritual weapon. They would march out, not as desperate refugees, but as the instruments of divine will, holding aloft the spear that had spilled the blood of God himself, prepared to die, but more importantly, prepared to kill. On June 28, 1098, the army, now split into 6 small battle divisions led by the major princes, prepared for the ultimate gamble. They could not remain trapped inside the city any longer. Starvation would accomplish what Kerboga's swords could not, forcing them into a desperate, all-or-nothing engagement. They opened the Iron Gate, the only exit not completely blocked by the Turkish siege lines, and streamed forth. Peter the Hermit, who had seen his people's crusade obliterated, now marched at the head, carrying the Holy Lance, flanked by priests chanting ancient, terrible hymns of war and sacrifice. This was not a military maneuver. It was a religious exorcism, a suicide charge dressed up as a divine mandate. The fate of the entire crusade, the fate of Christendom in the East, rested on the terrifying gamble that a piece of rusted iron was stronger than 100,000 Turkish swords, and the unified might of the Islamic world, roaring for their extermination. The gamble was terrifying, and the house always wins. The victorious, blood-soaked charge at Dorylaeum had bought the Crusaders one thing: the terrifying opportunity to march directly into the abyss. They moved from the brief, glorious battlefield of fire and steel into a literal, scorching oven, where the very sun was their ultimate, relentless enemy. The vast Anatolian landscape, stretching like the dried, cracked skin of a forgotten giant, consumed them whole. Their armor became instruments of torture, heating the flesh beneath, and the lack of water turned their very blood into thick, sluggish syrup, barely able to sustain life. This was no longer a noble march for the faith. It was a slow, agonizing funeral procession across the face of a dying continent. Every day, the invisible enemy claimed its victims: thirst, dysentery, and the gnawing terror of perpetual hunger that hollowed out the souls of even the fiercest knights. The rumors began to circulate. Dark whispers passed around dying campfires, whispers of men driven so insane by starvation that they turned their eyes on the weakest among them, a horrifying truth that the chroniclers dared not fully write down. The line between salvation and utter savagery had vanished. But even this march of the damned had an objective, a final intimidating destination that promised either glorious victory or total annihilation. Antioch, the gateway to the Holy Land, the jewel of the Orient, the fortress designed not by mortal men, but by the very gods of war themselves. For centuries, its impossibly high walls had stood defiant, 400 colossal towers rising from the stone, protecting a city so sprawling, so vast, that the remaining 100,000 crusaders couldn't even dream of fully encircling it. It was the ultimate medieval stronghold, a city that scoffed at siege engines. When the ragged, skeletal army finally crested the ridge and saw the intimidating shadow of Antioch spread out before them, a chilling, soul-crushing realization swept through the ranks. They were too few, too starved, and impossibly late. The city was impenetrable, and the siege they were about to begin was a guaranteed recipe for their extermination. They settled into a slow, grinding siege that was doomed from the very first day. The lack of supplies was instant and catastrophic. Bohemond, the cunning Norman, pushed deep into the surrounding enemy countryside, often returning with nothing but blood, corpses, and empty promises, the land itself having been scoured clean. The weather turned against them with biblical vengeance. The autumn rains came, turning the camp into a sea of viscous, disease-ridden mud. Then winter descended upon them like a freezing, suffocating shroud, a relentless cold they were utterly unprepared to face after the desert crossing. The knights, the nobility of Europe, the proudest warriors of the West, were reduced to miserable, shivering infantry, their status dissolving into the freezing mud. Their armor, once a symbol of prestige, now felt like a cage of ice. The famine reached catastrophic levels. Men stopped praying for victory and started praying for death, just to end the cold, agonizing emptiness in their stomachs. The princes, starved and furious, began turning on each other, their bitter rivalries boiling over the empty cooking pots. Raymond of Toulouse and Bohemond fought openly, not over tactics, but over who would claim ownership of Antioch if they ever somehow managed to breach its walls. The common soldiers saw the sickening hypocrisy, their leaders arguing over territory while they ate roots and boiled leather. The most devastating blow, however, came not from the impenetrable walls of Antioch, but from within the ranks of the supposed leaders. Stephen of Blois, a man who had sworn the most sacred oath to God in Clermont, finally broke. He was a brilliant letter writer, a man of refined tastes, but a spectacular failure as a true warrior. He looked at the endless frozen siege, the dying men, and the insurmountable walls, and his aristocratic resolve finally crumbled into dust and despair. Convinced the entire Christian enterprise was a hopeless catastrophe ordained for destruction, he made the decision that would forever stain his name. He deserted. He packed his bags, took his remaining retinue, and fled back toward the relative safety of Constantinople. His departure was not just the loss of troops. It was a devastating dagger plunged into the heart of morale. It signaled to the entire watching world that the great Christian crusade was failing, and the leaders themselves were abandoning the cause to die in the frozen ditch. This act of calculated cowardice had immediate, terrifying consequences. On his flight, Stephen encountered the massive Sultanic Relief Army, an unprecedented Islamic force led by the legendary commander Kerboga, roaring toward Antioch to wipe the Crusaders off the map. Stephen of Blois, seeing his chance to justify his desertion, lied to Kerboga, claiming the Crusaders were already defeated, decimated, and on the verge of total collapse. This monumental lie bought Kerboga time, making him slow his approach, believing the starving invaders were no longer a threat. It was the greatest military mistake Kerboga would ever make. But at the time, it looked like the final bitter end for the Crusaders. They were caught between the immovable city and the unstoppable Islamic army barreling down on them. But even in this darkest hour, a flicker of wicked, desperate opportunity emerged. The walls of Antioch were strong, yes, but its defense ultimately relied on men. Men who, like the Crusaders, were susceptible to gold and fear and the corrosive power of betrayal. Bohemond, the ultimate pragmatist, understood that a direct assault could not succeed. Only treachery could breach the impregnable city. He began to search methodically for the weakness, the single human flaw in Antioch's mighty armor. And he found him. He found a man named Firuz, an Armenian renegade who had converted to Islam, and now guarded 3 of the colossal towers along the wall. Firuz hated his current masters, the Turkish emir Yaghi-Siyan, and Bohemond discovered that this hatred ran deeper than his current loyalties. The negotiation was swift, silent, and deadly. Gold was exchanged, and a secret, terrifying plan was whispered into the night wind. A guaranteed path to open the gates, not through force, but through calculated, cold-blooded betrayal. The fate of the entire First Crusade, the fate of Jerusalem itself, the fate of a generation of Europeans, now hinged entirely on the greed of one renegade guard and the treacherous, desperate resolve of Bohemond of Toronto.